Jake Turner had always been a man who valued peace, privacy, and personal responsibility. As a former military veteran and now a self-defense instructor, he had seen his fair share of real danger and knew how to handle himself in high-stress situations. That was why, when he moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood with a large private property, he had hoped to finally settle into a peaceful life away from conflict. Unfortunately for him, his next-door neighbor was Karen Whitmore. Karen was the kind of woman who acted like she owned the entire street, constantly meddling in other people's business, filing complaints over the smallest inconveniences, and throwing tantrums whenever she didn't get her way. Since the day Jake moved in, she had made it clear that she didn't like him, and for the past year, she had made his life as difficult as possible. At first, it was small things. Complaints to the HOA about his truck being too loud when he left for work in the morning, accusations that his security cameras were invading her privacy, even though they were on his property, and passive-aggressive notes left on his mailbox about how he wasn't the right kind of person for the neighborhood. Jake ignored her. He had dealt with worse in his life. And as long as Karen stayed out of his way, he had no interest in wasting energy on her petty behavior. But that all changed the day she almost ran him over in his own driveway. It had been a quiet Saturday afternoon. Jake was outside fixing the wooden fence that lined his property, minding his own business. His driveway was long, leading from the street to his garage at the back of his house, and he had specifically positioned himself far away from the main road so he wouldn't be disturbed. Then, without warning, Karen's white SUV came barreling down his driveway. Jake barely had time to react before the vehicle whipped past him, the side mirror nearly clipping his arm as she sped through like she owned the place. Jake jumped back, heart pounding as he watched Karen slam on the brakes near his garage, then throw the car into reverse. "What the hell?" he shouted, stepping back as she sped toward him again, this time stopping just feet away from where he stood. Karen threw open her driver's side door and stepped out, her face twisted in fury. "You need to move your damn truck, Jake," she screeched, jabbing a manicured finger toward his vehicle, which was parked in his own driveway, not even blocking the road. Jake exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Karen, what the hell were you doing? You almost hit me." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she scoffed, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "You were standing in the way." Jake stared at her, incredulous. Standing in the way? In his own driveway. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "This is my property. You have no right to be driving through here." Karen rolled her eyes. "The HOA says we're allowed to use each other's driveways for turnarounds." "You're being unreasonable." Jake narrowed his eyes. "I don't give a damn what you think the HOA allows. This is private property, and you're not welcome here." Karen took a step closer, getting right in his face. "I don't care what you think, you—" Jake saw it before she even moved, the tension in her shoulders, the shift in her weight. He had trained for years to anticipate attacks before they happened. She lunged at him, shoving him hard in the chest. But Jake was already stepping aside, his body moving on instinct. He caught her wrist just before she could hit him again, twisting it just enough to stop her attack, but not enough to hurt her. Karen stumbled back, gasping like he had punched her, eyes wide with fake outrage. Then, before Jake could even react, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Oh my God! Help! I'm being attacked!" She shrieked into the phone, dramatically collapsing onto the ground like he had just body slammed her. Jake froze for a moment, then let out a deep sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. This was going to be a problem. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. 3 squad cars pulled up in front of his property, and officers poured out, weapons at the ready as they rushed toward the scene. Karen turned on the waterworks instantly, sobbing as she pointed at Jake. "He attacked me. He grabbed me and threw me to the ground." Jake raised his hand slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Officers, I live here." "She—" "Get on the ground," one of the officers barked. Jake gritted his teeth. He could see it already. They were buying her act. Karen, still fake crying, sniffled. He's dangerous. I've told the HOA so many times that he doesn't belong here. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. Jake kept his hands up. Officers, I have security cameras all over this property. The entire thing is on video. One of the officers hesitated. You have footage? Jake nodded. Everything from the moment she drove onto my property, without permission, to when she lunged at me first. Karen's crocodile tears instantly dried up. Don't listen to him, she shrieked. He's lying. He manipulated the footage. The lead officer gave her a sharp look. Ma'am, we haven't even seen it yet. Karen's jaw tightened. Realizing she had slipped up, the officer turned to Jake. Show us the footage. Jake lowered his hand slowly, then motioned toward the security panel by his garage. Follow me. The officers watched in silence as Jake pulled up the clear, unedited footage. Karen's SUV speeding onto his property. Karen getting out, yelling at him. Karen lunging at him first. Karen calling 911 after she realized she lost. The moment the footage ended, the officers exchanged looks. The lead officer turned to Karen, his expression stone cold. Ma'am, you just wasted police resources on a false emergency call. That's a criminal offense. Karen's face drained of color. Wait, no. He assaulted me. You can't seriously believe him over me. The officer sighed. Ma'am, you trespassed on private property, drove recklessly, and initiated physical contact. You're under arrest for filing a false police report and criminal trespassing. Karen's screech of outrage could probably be heard across the entire neighborhood as the officers cuffed her and read her rights. Jake folded his arms as he watched her get hauled toward the squad car, shaking his head. One of the officers turned back to him. Sorry about this, Mr. Turner. We've dealt with her before. Jake smirked. Yeah, I figured. As Karen was stuffed into the back seat, she thrashed wildly. I'm going to sue you. I'll have your jobs. The officer shut the door in her face. Jake sighed, looking at the mess Karen had left behind. Well, he muttered, cracking his knuckles. That takes care of one problem. But knowing Karen, this wasn't over yet. The moment Karen was shoved into the back of the squad car, the neighborhood fell into an eerie silence. A handful of neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk, watching in stunned disbelief as their self-proclaimed community leader was being hauled away like a common criminal. Jake Turner exhaled slowly, keeping his stance relaxed but ready. He had been in worse situations before, but something about this wasn't sitting right. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She had spent years manipulating people, getting her way through intimidation and tantrums. He knew she wasn't going to let this go. The lead officer, Sergeant Daniels, turned to Jake and gave him a curious look. Mr. Turner, I'd like to ask you a few more questions before we process this. Jake nodded. Sure thing, Sergeant. Daniels motioned for one of the officers to take Karen down to the station while the others lingered around Jake's property, clearly not convinced that things were over yet. Karen was still screeching from inside the police car, kicking the door and yelling about how she was being falsely arrested and that she had connections who would make sure she was free within the hour. Daniels ignored her. He turned to Jake, lowering his voice. We've had multiple complaints about her in the past, but nothing ever stuck. She's good at twisting stories, filing complaints, and making it look like she's a victim. This is the first time we've had solid evidence against her. Jake sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. So, I'm guessing she's tried this before? Daniel's lips twitched into something close to amusement. Not just tried. She succeeded. Jake's jaw tightened. How? Daniels folded his arms. Every time something happens, she's quick to press charges first, creating enough chaos to confuse the system. If the accused backs down, she uses that to negotiate lesser charges or get out of legal trouble completely. But this time, he smirked. She messed up. Jake raised an eyebrow. Because of the footage? Daniels nodded. Because of the footage, yes. but also because she called 911 for a fake emergency, which is a serious charge. Combine that with reckless endangerment, criminal trespassing, and attempting to assault you, she's in real trouble this time. Jake crossed his arms, watching the officers bagging evidence near his driveway. So, what's next? Daniels hesitated before sighing. Look, off the record, my advice? Lock down your property even more than you already have. Karen isn't going to sit in a cell and reflect on her mistakes. She's going to come for you. Jake exhaled sharply, already knowing Daniels was right. Karen was delusional. She wasn't just entitled. She was dangerous. Even as she was being driven away, she was screaming threats, promising she would have the last laugh. Jake turned back to his house, his mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Jake Turner knew Karen Whitmore wouldn't go down without a fight. Even as the police car, carrying her, sped away, her screeches of rage and threats still echoed in his ears. He had dealt with worse in his military days, but there was something uniquely exhausting about dealing with entitled people like Karen, people who believed rules didn't apply to them. Sergeant Daniels remained on Jake's property for a while longer, ensuring all statements were collected and Karen's reckless behavior was fully documented. The neighborhood, once a peaceful retreat, was now a spectacle. Residents lingered on their lawns, whispering amongst themselves, still processing what they had just witnessed. Jake watched them carefully. Some looked relieved, as if Karen had been a problem for them too. Others, mostly her close-knit circle of self-righteous HOA warriors, looked uncertain, their loyalty shaken. Daniels walked up to Jake, handing him a card. This is my direct line. If you get any retaliation, you call me. Immediately, Jake accepted the card with a nod. Thanks, Sergeant. I appreciate it. Daniels studied him for a moment, then smirked. You handled yourself well. Most people panic when we show up in force. Jake gave a small, knowing smile. I've dealt with worse. Daniels chuckled. Figured. Stay safe, Mr. Turner. With that, the police packed up and left, taking the chaos of the evening with them. But Jake knew it wasn't truly over. Karen was vindictive. She would come for him in any way she could, and he would be ready. Karen's retaliation begins. It only took 48 hours before the first retaliation attempt landed in Jake's mailbox. A formal complaint from the Homeowners Association, claiming that Jake was disrupting the peace and had engaged in violent, threatening behavior that was dangerous to the community. Jake laughed aloud as he read it. Karen, even from a holding cell, was still trying to play the victim. A footnote at the bottom recommended that the HOA board strongly consider eviction procedures if Jake continued his aggressive actions. Jake rolled his eyes. So this was her game. She couldn't win legally, so she was trying to get him removed through the HOA. Too bad for her. Jake had receipts. He pulled out his security footage again, carefully crafting a legal counter-response. He included timestamps, police reports, and Karen's criminal charges, ensuring every single claim in her complaint was invalidated. Then, just for fun, he carbon copied his lawyer on the response. He mailed it back within an hour. Karen learns the hard way. Karen's legal problems only worsened in the following days. She had 2 previous warnings for filing false police reports, which meant this third offense turned into a felony charge. The reckless endangerment charge stuck after police confirmed her vehicle nearly hit Jake, caught clearly on camera. The HOA complaint backfired spectacularly after Jake's legal response publicly exposed her lies. With nowhere to run, Karen finally snapped. A week after her arrest, she showed up at Jake's driveway again, this time with 2 men in tow. Jake had been inside his garage when he heard the commotion. He stepped out, hands in his pockets, watching as Karen, flanked by 2 men in suits, stood on the edge of his property. She was smug, despite the ankle monitor strapped to her leg. Jake sighed. Karen, you're trespassing. Again, she folded her arms. I'm here with my lawyers. They're serving you. Jake raised an eyebrow, completely unimpressed. Serving me for what? One of the suited men, a thin, nervous-looking lawyer, cleared his throat and handed Jake an envelope. Jake took it, ripped it open, and read it slowly. Then he burst out laughing. Karen's face twisted in anger. "What's so funny?" Jake shook his head, still grinning. "This lawsuit. You're suing me for emotional distress?" Karen's eyes flashed. "You assaulted me. You ruined my reputation and you got me arrested. You think I'm just going to let that go?" Jake smirked. "Karen, you nearly ran me over, attacked me first, and then lied to the cops. And I have all of it on video." Karen's jaw tightened. Her lawyer, now visibly sweating, cleared his throat again. Mr. Turner, perhaps we can negotiate." "Nope," Jake cut in, handing the envelope back to the lawyer. "You can take this back. I'm countersuing for trespassing, defamation, and legal harassment." Karen blanched. "You can't do that." Jake grinned wider. "I already did." And with that, he walked away, leaving Karen fuming in his driveway. The final blow. Karen's frivolous lawsuit was thrown out within weeks. The judge, after reviewing Jake's footage and police reports, dismissed every single one of her claims and instead granted Jake's countersuit. She was ordered to pay damages for trespassing on private property, filing a false police report, legal harassment. Her once pristine reputation in the community was destroyed. The HOA, now embarrassed by her antics, expelled her from the board, cutting off her last shred of power. Then came the final humiliation. Her landlord evicted her, citing community concerns after her criminal charges. And just like that, Karen Whitmore was gone. Jake, for the first time in months, enjoyed the silence. A fitting ending. On the day Karen officially moved out, Jake stood on his porch, watching as the moving trucks loaded the last of her belongings. A few neighbors, watching from afar, clapped and whispered in satisfaction. Jake smirked, taking a sip of his coffee as Karen turned to glare at him one last time. He simply raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. Karen, fuming, stomped into her car and sped away, this time with nowhere to return to. With a satisfied sigh, Jake turned back toward his house, finally able to enjoy his property in peace. Just before stepping inside, he paused, pulling out a small sign and hammering it into his driveway. "Private property. Trespassers will be recorded and prosecuted. Entitled neighbors will be laughed at." And with that, Jake finally closed the door on Karen Whitmore forever.